Pages and pages. I'm going to boil it down so Mike has as many words as are left. Mike Burton was elected Metro Executive Officer and took office in January 1995. His education, his legislative service, administrative experience at Marylhurst College, and various government assignments impressed a majority of the voters. They were apparently convinced that he had the background, the commitment, and the political ability to head up a regional government body that serves our 3 counties and 24 cities in the Portland metropolitan area. Let's welcome Metro Executive Officer Mike Burton to this podium.
Thank you, Don. Probably only in Oregon would you have this many people turn out to talk about land use, and it's pleasing to see as many of you here. This is the 4th time, actually, I've had the privilege of addressing the City Club, but it's actually the first time I've had the podium to myself. And I'd like to think that this is probably because the City Club has finally recognized my singular oratorical skills, or at least they have decided that I can be trusted up here for more than 15 minutes by myself. But the fact is, I think that my solo appearance here today is less reflective of any talents that I might possess, and more a recognition, a growing recognition, of the incredible point at which this region finds itself and the potential dangers that this community finds itself in should it fail to act swiftly and with clear purpose. To me, it's both odd but understandable that the debate around the question of implementation and execution of our planning efforts is focused generally on one short phrase, 3 letters, UGB, the urban growth boundary. Almost daily I am asked, Burton, are you going to move the boundary? Or is it 1,000 acres or 4,000 acres or 10,000 acres or 0? Or do you support expanding the urban growth boundary? But those aren't the right questions. In fact, I'm not even the right person to ask, because these questions should be asked of yourselves, because it is you in the final analysis that will make those decisions, not me. The urban growth boundary has become an icon in our growing debate about growth. It has become a symbol of our fight against urban sprawl. And in this region we have said, not here. And while the UGB is a symbol, it is also a tool for managing growth. How we use that tool is the key to the question before us. Ironically, it will not be the movement nor the non-movement of the boundary that will determine our success. It's not where the boundary sits or where it stays, but what we do with the lands inside the boundary where we will ultimately have our mark. As the Metro Executive Officer, I have the responsibility for and am accountable as an opinion leader who can help form this debate. The Metro Council, which has the final authority to make this decision, is responsible for making that decision about when, where, and how to move the boundary. But ultimately, even the council decision will be based on the willingness of the public to understand, accept, and finally to advocate for the kind of compact urban growth that will change the way we use the land and where we draw the line. That means we have to work harder to move this conversation beyond the forum of the City Club and the local planning commission and bring it right into the living rooms of people throughout this region. In order to accomplish the ambitious goals described in 2040 Growth Concept, it will mean a change in every single community, whether that's in Dunthorpe or in Monroe Street in Milwaukee or Main Street in Hillsborough or along Cruz Way. There will be changes, and the changes are here if you haven't noticed, and they're never easy to take. There is no going back. In the 1 year since I last spoke to you, the Tri-Counties region's population has increased by 30,000, 36,000 if you include Clark County. That's in 1 year. That's the equivalent of adding a new Tigard or a Lake Oswego to the region in this just last year. 9,600 houses and apartments have been built in the metro area. There are nearly 24,000 new cars registered on the road in the region. And we've built 25,800 parking spaces for those cars, which takes up about 300 acres of land. As we look to the future, we anticipate about 450,000 more people added to the urban area in the metro area during the next 20 years. That's the same population, roughly, of Portland today. It's like adding another Portland to this region. To put it another way, by this evening, 75 more people will be joining us for dinner than we had at breakfast this morning. And that's happening 7 days a week, every day of the year. In the same year, we've also seen an incredible change in our economy. More than $11 billion of high-tech capital investments have been announced in this last year alone. High-tech has become the leading manufacturing employer in Oregon, outstripping jobs in the wood products industry. And the metropolitan area has seen an explosion in its role as a distribution center, not only for ourselves, but for the Intermountain states. Goods from the Pacific Rim and other parts of the world move into our waterways and up I-5 to be redistributed rapidly growing areas of Idaho, western Montana, Wyoming, and Nevada at 3 times the rate of our booming population. The growth in this region is transforming the world around us. It will change our neighborhoods, your community, the street where you live, and maybe even the house next door. That house on the corner lot might be replaced by a small row of row houses. Your neighbors might add an apartment into their home for an aging parent or a college student. That store in the corner may be replaced by a mixed-use building with a business on the street and apartments overhead. If this doesn't happen on your street, it will happen in the next block, and that will affect you. These are not radical changes. Still, they are changes just the same. And more will come, whether we plan for it or not. The difference in this region is that we have the opportunity to shape and change by choice and not by chance. We must, each of us individually, look at our own neighborhood and begin to imagine how it will handle a little piece of growth that is coming, and to find a way to make that change not only fit, but contribute to our sense of community. Eugene Linden recently wrote in an article in Foreign Affairs that today there are more than 112 cities in the world with a population of over 1 million, double the number of 30 years ago. And this is in the so-called developed world. In the developing world, the million-plus cities have increased even faster. With this, writes Linden, has come havoc and pollution and poverty. He also says as populations grow and cities become more crowded, the margin of error narrows and the cost of mistakes rises. It is only through positive leadership and harmonious, hard-working, ecology-conscious citizens, Linden concludes, that these pressures can be overcome. And that's our advantage. We have those elements, but we have to continue to foster them and make sure that they work. It all comes back to the land. And in Oregon, it's always been about the land. A recent values survey demonstrates that this: people choose forest and farm preservation as their #1 priority. Protection of wildlife areas come nearly as high on the list. The next closest priority are economic development and lower property taxes or making more money. All of those things seem to fit. We are blessed with being the first state in this union to recognize that the land was filling up and that it was possible to destroy our natural resources unless we had some plan, some design on how to protect them. We set out to strike a balance between protecting those natural resources at the same time allowing development and commerce that would sustain our communities. A few years ago, here in the metropolitan area, the region sat down and asked itself, what do we want the future to look like? Together, we set out a vision for where we're going and what we would want our children to find when they became our age. From that, Metro's 2040 growth concept. The 2040 growth concept integrates land use, transportation, air and water quality, and open spaces planning. It provides a path that included population and economic growth with protecting livability and encouraging a healthy economy. That concept, so highly touted, is recognized nationally as a model for growth management. It is a concept that on paper is highly defensible. And now comes its greatest challenge, the transition from rhetoric to reality, from planning to implementation. The first step in this is underway. At Metro, the staff has refined and examined the land currently inside the urban growth boundary and how it will be used under current plans. We have forecast the population growth expected in the next 20 years. Metro then allocated those population figures by areas, cities, zones within the metro area to determine the number of additional dwelling units and employment needs for the region. With those figures in hand, we asked each local jurisdiction to tell us how they would handle a population increase, and if they couldn't, to tell us why and how to estimate how much additional land might be needed to do so. The response has been very positive. Local governments indicated that they would need about 4,500 acres to accommodate the growth forecasted for the next 20 years. Some cities, Portland and Gresham, as well as Metro's Policy Advisory Committee, asked us to allocate those numbers based on not moving the boundary at all. We ran those figures also and recently sent them out to local jurisdictions for comment, and we await their response. But this is no longer merely an academic or mathematical exercise. This is now reality. The rhetoric is past, and now we face the actual challenges of rezoning, changing building codes, achieving flexible permitting, finding financing for new projects, and to ensure that we have protection and enhancement of open spaces of our water and quality and air quality in this region. Even more significantly, we face the challenge of engaging the public and garnering its support for the challenges coming to their own communities, to their own neighborhoods, and maybe even on your own street. This is no small task. This region receives accolades from all over the country. Chambers of commerces, businesses, and civic organizations flock here by the dozens to find out what our secrets are. And while we garner stories in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times touting our innovative land use policies and urban growth boundary, the local newspapers in the region often report different views. In the March 15th issue of the Business Journal, it's reported that Lake Oswego City Council is considering a so-called growth-neutral policy that aims to bill developers for what they believe would be the full impact of cost of growth. According to the article, this would add $25,000 to the price of a new home in Lake Oswego. It's not a community widely known for its affordable housing already. In a recent speech at the City Club, Portland's Mayor Vera Katz celebrated the fact that new housing starts in Portland have dramatically increased. And I applaud them for that. In the past 2 years, housing starts in Portland have nearly doubled. They had about 1,000 units going up about 2 years ago, but this year they hope to build about 2,000 units. Still, even at 2,000 units a year, for the next 20 years, that would give Portland about 40,000 new units, which is short of the 53 to 70,000 they will need if we don't move the boundary. I attended a meeting earlier this week with a group of elected officials from Washington County. They feel that the crunch of Metro's timeline, the one that I've been pushing, and they ask that we give them more time to communicate with their citizens. Some jurisdictions are further ahead of others in making changes to their cities, but the concerns expressed by those officials are real. Communicating with the public is critical to success. While cities all over the country come here seeking the secrets of our success, we're facing our toughest challenge. Taking that incredible 2040 map off the wall and putting it on the ground is the task before us. The fear of the word density is probably the single biggest concern that would prevent us from reaching our destination. The just issued City Club report on growth speaks to that very concern. Increased density, it says, is often equated in people's mind with images of tightly packed Manhattan-style high-rise apartments, a highly negative perception by many residents of the region. The word density is weighted with many negative images. The City Club's growth report is great. I agree with most of it, not all of it. But look at who was interviewed. Take a look at the back and see who they talked to, which is great. It's a great cast of characters, but it's the usual suspects. It's us. It's almost as if we were all talking to ourselves. And the fact is, we've got to get outside of this room and talk to people who aren't here. We cannot continue to have this conversation amongst ourselves. We must find innovative ways of reaching non-joiners, those people who are unlikely to attend one of Metro's open house discussions, who don't belong to organizations on our fax lists, and who are not likely to be listening to the City Club speech on OPB. In a public opinion survey recently conducted, a majority of people say that they don't want higher density. At the same time, 57%, over half, agreed with a statement that, quote, having one more house per block was a reasonable price to pay for less urban sprawl. This survey reveals a difference it can make when we stop talking in fuzzy, generic terms and begin to speak to more specifically about what the changes will mean to citizens who don't get to these City Club speeches or read these reports. It is imperative that we put these ideas and these concepts in very personal terms. The type of development and the changes in Metro's 2040 growth concept describes is nothing new to you. It's nothing you've perhaps seen before, but what does it mean? What are we talking about? In the central city area, Downtown Portland will become much more dense, requiring more high-rise office buildings and tall apartment buildings. Many existing neighborhoods would remain relatively the same. Those that do would see changes happen over time, including redevelopment of some existing structures and the addition of 1 or 2 new houses in some blocks. Again, a new house a couple of blocks away means another car at your intersection, another person at the corner store, and another person at the bus stop. Densities in new neighborhoods will primarily be achieved through somewhat smaller lots, averaging about 6,000 square feet. The current average lot size in Alameda and Irvington is about 5,000 square feet. In the regional centers, Beaverton, Gresham, Washington Square, Clackamas Town Center, Milwaukee, and Hillsborough, would over time expand to include densities similar to the present downtown areas of Salem or Corvallis. In cities like Beaverton, downtown residential living must be encouraged, and higher residential densities must be achieved to accommodate the growing population. The role of these areas as a suburb of Portland is over. Beaverton and Gresham are already among the largest cities in the state, and they are working to become more and more of their own cities, keeping their own sense of place. The town centers, the projected densities for town centers, such as Lake Oswego, Forest Grove, and West Lynn, would be similar to the present-day Westmoreland or downtown Hillsborough. Transit corridors are areas with 10-minute headers, that is, transit service with 10-minute during peak hours where you can catch a bus. In these areas, typical development will include row houses, garden apartments, duplexes, low-rise apartments, and office buildings as a way of having enough people and activities to support a village. There is good news about all of this. The public acceptance is still mixed, but people are voting with their feet and proving that these concepts can and do work. The City Club report states that, quote, far-flung suburban, and you gotta get rid of that word suburban, by the way, far-flung suburban neighborhoods continue to grow. Neighborhoods often resist increases in residential density. Transit ridership is increasing at a slower rate than the rate of population growth, and the number of vehicle miles traveled has increased dramatically, which has resulted in congestion. But that's old news. Sometime around 1992, things began to change. Maybe it's a coincidence that this happened just when Metro began to work on the 2040 growth plan. Probably it's more an effect of the rapid growth in the urban growth boundary finally being tight enough to do its job. But TriMet ridership is up. In the last year, bus transit ridership increased by 7.5%. They're averaging about 225,000 riders a day. Max ridership is up 13%, more than 27,000 riders a day. This is great news, but transit is still inadequate in the regional centers outside the central city. It is impossible almost to take a bus between Tigard and Tualatin. And more people want to take those trips than to just come into downtown Portland. And we can't hardly ask cities to do a skinny streets policy if we don't provide transit service to replace that. So we're faced with that challenge that has to be met on the ground. Market indicators also tell a new story. Townhouses and condos. In 1990, they made up only 3% of the market. In 1995, they're 11% of the market and growing. A Grubb and Ellis report reports that condominium and apartment development is booming. Apartment vacancies rates are down to about 2.5%. Specialty housing, such as housing for the elderly, is now predicted to be an especially good investment and is being planned and built in a number of areas around the region. Housing starts in the city of Portland, as I mentioned, have doubled. The city of Portland just a few years ago was considered built out, and yet they're doubling the number of houses they're building today. And that's due to infill. Houses built that on considerably already developed land make up now 17% of the building permits in the region. So there is some good things going on. And we have new urban design. Recent stories in the Oregonian and other local newspapers have highlighted this. Unique and innovative infill and redevelopment projects such as offices, which are home offices that are building in the Tualatin Commons, the kinds of things that we have the promise for of a new urban village in the River District in Portland are examples of this. And outside of Portland itself in Fairview Village, an area which is an 88-acre development, where 600 units will be built. A third of those are single family, a third will be row houses and townhouses, a third will be multifamily with a duplex with a senior care assisted rentals. There will be 30 to 50,000 square feet of office space, more than 10 acres of commercial and retail site, open space, civic offices. Fairview's new city hall will go there, and parks. The first 20 houses are built and the roads are being completed for the retail area. In Hillsborough, the Wrinkle-Pack Trust Intel site, Hillsborough is rezoning 1/3 of its city to accomplish the Orinco Village plan development to build 1,800 units. It includes mixed-use retail and residential and housing ranging from multifamily to single-family on lots averaging 6,000 square feet. I remain optimistic that we will overcome the challenges we are facing, but I also must be realistic about the size of the challenges ahead of us. At a hearing on the Orinkle plan in Hillsborough recently, hundreds of citizens showed up, not so much to protest the project or its design, which they liked, but to express their dismay that their city was going to change at all. And there are other issues to consider when we look at the issues in this region and the impact of whether we move the boundary or not. Cornelius is an example of that. Cornelius is a small city. It will have to take about 1,000 new residential units if we don't move the boundary. And the people in Cornelius feel they can do that. They have the capacity for it, but they will still ask for an expansion of the urban growth boundary because they need industrial land. They want about 30 acres of that so they can provide jobs in their community so they don't fall prey to becoming a bedroom community for the high-tech industry cities that are growing around them. It's an important issue for a small city's survival. More jobs help their tax base for schools and other services and prevent Cornelius from simply disappearing on the map. And there's the effect of our growth on rural areas. Vernonia, one of several cities outside the urban growth boundary that's affected and has had and experiencing phenomenal growth. Before the flood took place, a planner from Vernonia called me to say that they had received applications for building permits, more applications for building permits in the last 8 months than they had in the previous 8 years. And the fact was that the people who were building those houses in Vernonia were working in Hillsborough and traveling between the two cities. It is our responsibility to ensure the standards that we have set for this region for development don't simply drive additional growth outside the boundary. The urban growth boundary affects those outlying communities, Vernonia, Sandy, Canby, Newburgh, Scappoose, and so on. We must be aware of the issues facing those cities and the impact that we have on them, that over a time will affect the livability not only of their cities, but of ours. To some, this may not sound like very good news, but I'd be less than honest if I did not point out the enormity of the task facing all of us. We have always met the challenges in this region, in this state. In times of crisis, we rally around one another, we drop our provincial prerogatives, and we get the job done. And I would argue that we are indeed in crisis. There is no rising waters, no volcanic ash coming down on us, but we're in a crisis. We're in a contest for the very soul of this regional community. And to keep its heart beating strongly, we will need to take more than just a pronouncement I can make about the doability of a line, because the doing is up to you. The responsibility of how this region will accommodate future growth falls squarely on your shoulders. We have a responsibility to understand the choices that this region is facing and to take responsibility for the choices that we are making. Someone recently asked me if I thought people really were willing to make the trade-offs that we would have to do to envision 2040. Well, I would say, what would we do without making those trade-offs? What would we lose if we don't do this? Sprawl and the loss of farm and forest land, the destruction of our urban green spaces, the loss of our community, increased congestion, the loss of air and water quality in this region would be the results. Metro's planning process demands that the public be our partners, but we need even more than that from you. We need advocates. We need you to go out and find the people who are not in this room and tell them what's at stake. Because once the politicians and the planners have all had their say, it is the citizens that will have to make the tough choices and the decisions about what kind of communities we will have for ourselves and our children. So while all this begins with a question of the land, it is ultimately about people. The people who live in our great communities and wish to keep them that way. Because after all, it is your home. We're at a critical time in our region's history. It is time to turn the page to the next chapter of the story, a story that can be the envy of every other metropolitan area. But we've never done this before. No one ever has done this before. So we shouldn't be afraid of where we're going. Just recognize that we have to do it together or it won't work. The preservation of farm and forest land, statewide land use planning, open spaces protection, these are ideals found in the heart of every Oregonian. If those ideals are what you stand for, then it's time for you to stand up and be counted. This is where you begin to take your place with all of those who went before to make Oregon and this region a very special place. You have told us you want us to protect livability, build better communities, and protect farm land from urban sprawl. Now it's your opportunity to take responsibility and share in the credit for what we will do. It all comes down to a very personal level, what each of us are willing to do, one by one, neighborhood by neighborhood, business by business, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So I hope I will be asked to be here at the City Club again next year, when I can report on the progress we've made in turning the 2040 growth concept into a working plan. And in doing so, I hope that you will all join me in celebrating our success. Thank you.
Great to hear you. Let me interject a couple of announcements that I didn't make. I think those of you who failed to read your bulletin may wonder why we're running over. We're running over because we scheduled this until 12:30 because of the dual nature of our program today. 12:30, 1:30. Thank you, Paula, for nodding the wrong way. I wasn't able to tell you where the Innovative in Workplace Technology Forum is being held. I know now. Again, it's April 4, Thursday, 5:30 to 7 p.m. in the United Way Community Center, 3rd floor. Call Nancy Martin at the office if there are any questions. And now Chuck Shattuck will ask the first question from up here. Chuck?
Thanks. Mike, to what extent is Metro involved with Clark County and its land use planning? And how important is this relationship? And how does it impact our tri-county planning?
Okay. Before I answer that question, I'm not trying to evade this one, but I do want to point out, talking about involvement, that on your table there are some 2040 newsletters, and the purple one on the back has a list of open houses that we are beginning I think at the end of this month, starting tonight. And I would ask you to pay attention to those, ask people to show up at those and get there yourself. Clark County, of course, Washington recently adopted a land use laws a little bit similar to what we have here. Unfortunately, that's been very contentious over there. They're trying to do in 3 years what took us 20 to 25 years to do here. We continue to work with them. They sit as an advisory member or a member of our MPO. We work with them on transportation issues. Clark County, to some extent, I almost like to think of it as a pressure valve for this side. I think all the people who don't like our land use planning and our taxes move over there. And to some extent, what's happening over there right now is it's collapsing. They're beginning to have trouble with their infrastructure. They're beginning to have trouble with the availability of land. I would guess that they're going to be out of land the way that they're building it right now in about 5-10 years, and they'll have to move out or do something about it. So I think they're in trouble, and we will continue to work with them as much as we can because they indeed do affect what happens. About 26,000 people a day travel from Vancouver into Portland for jobs. So they're very much a part of our community, and we're very interested in how well they do. And we will work very closely to try to help them with their growth management efforts over there. But I think there's some problems. Is this for and against or just either or?
These are just questions. I'm Jeannie Dodson-Edgars. I'm a City Club member, and I'd like to put some unfuzzy words to those fuzzy words. Green spaces, access to green spaces means lot premiums. Okay, this is a human being trying to buy a house. It also means when you go out there and you're looking for a home, it means a realtor size you up, and if you're in your dungarees, forget it, you're not going to get a second glance, and they'll sell the lot from out from underneath you. What I'm seeing is really cutthroat competition for land. And we're looking at the home prices, which I know are not in the low ends. We're $150 to $250, but there's a lot of cutthroat competition out there. And I'm wanting to know who's going to ultimately win in this, and is there any attempt at curbing this land grab, and by those who are developing them can command those prices because the demand for the land is there. I'm concerned about the escalation of property values like it happened in LA and Orange County, and then the ultimate crash. What are we doing to prevent that?
Of course, there's a lot of debate about that question, and I would argue that the effect of the price of housing and the price of land is a result essentially of the market, and the market is moved by a number of other factors. It's one of the points in the City Club report that I disagree with. I think there was a suggestion that Metro should put a bond measure out to buy land. The problem is we'll end up pushing the market if we do that, and I don't think it's the right thing to do. The open spaces measure has already demonstrated that to some extent. I'm pleased with that. We're buying land, but they see government coming with a big pocket, and they're going to dip right into it. So you have to be very careful not to do that. I don't think government ought to lead the market. I think that the market ought to be led by the private sector. If we added 60,000 acres to the urban growth boundary tomorrow, affordable housing wouldn't be an issue. But the death of the central city would be an issue because it would move out. So it's a contentious issue. I don't have a real good answer for it. I think what we have to do is take a look at trying to reduce the amount of regulatory requirements sometimes that prevent people from building houses for less money. If you look at what goes into the cost of a house, the price of a house hasn't gone up as much as land, however. And so the issue is land, and you're right about that. But I think we're going to have to try to solve the issue of the price of land would be such an expansion of the urban growth boundary that it wouldn't work at all. But it's obviously of concern. The reason that the market, I think, has moved towards smaller lot dwellings is indeed due to that, because you get if you go out with an acre and you put 7 units on it, that's going to give a return to somebody, and that's going to give your price of land as a portion of that. If you put 14 units on it, you're getting a higher return. The price of that house might be down because the land cost is down, and it's economics 101 to put a relationship between supply and demand on land and housing. So that's one of the debates that we'll have, and there's some things we can do to try to make sure that the price is down. I worry about having a large urban reserve area because it increases the spec value of that property.
Charlotte Richards-Kreitzberg from Salem, but Portland City Club member, and I work with a subcommittee with the Planning Commission down there. And my question is very close to that. It is more, how do you convince the somewhat single issue pro-business and development community of the importance of the planning side of things?
Well, I think they do recognize that, at least in this community. You see a lot of developer bashing going on, and I don't think it's quite fair. They live here too. And the home builders and people like this who are out after a profit, certainly like any one of us, are also involved in trying to, concerned about that. I have a group, 2040 Means Business, that gives me their advice on these kinds of things. I haven't heard any of them urging massive expansion of the urban growth boundary, for example. What they will say to you is, look, we'll build this if we can do it. And the 3 factors that are of concern is market, obviously, which is one thing we just talked about. The other one is the question of government regulation. There's a lot of government regulations. They say, look, we'd like to build this, but when we go up the permit desk to do an infill project, we get blown out of the water. And the third one is the one that I'm talking about today, and that's citizen attitudes, saying we're not going to do that. The average home builder in the metropolitan area builds 8 to 10 homes a year. They're not interested in having large competition come in by having lots of huge swaths of land to do that on. So I find that the responsible developers and builders, which is the vast majority of them, are very willing to sit down and talk about this in a reasonable fashion, but they do want reality. So we need to engage them, and actually what I've tried to do in my capacity is reach out and bring them in. Come on in, and we'll argue at first, but once they get an understanding of what's going on, I found that relationship and that common interest is much closer than perhaps we would think.
Thank you.
Walt Roberts, City Club member. Mr. Burton, not long ago, David Rusk was here chatting with us and applauding our regions and communities' process of debating issues around urban growth and growth management, and gave us an A+ there. His point was that regarding race and poverty neighborhoods, we're moving in the wrong direction. His research and statistics that's what he said. So that struck me as a pretty important thing, and I hadn't really thought about it before. I wondered if you care to comment about, I'm not sure if you heard about his comments.
Yeah, I actually spent dinner and lunch with the guy.
So what's
And I've been to Albuquerque, by the way, and he doesn't work there. He was the mayor.
But Montgomery County was a model Montgomery County outside of Washington was a model that he pointed to. So your comments on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. That's an issue of concern for me. It's an issue for each one of the individual cities, of course, to respond to. But one of the things, and the City Club report points this out again, is both the state and the local fair share concept of trying to make certain you have a good mix of affordable pricing. And what's an affordable house? Somebody asked me, Burton, what's an affordable house? Or I asked someone that, and they said, well, it depends on how much money you have. And that's the key, but it's the buy-in price, and it's the ability to sustain your purchase if you want to have purchase. So I think there are projects like Albina Corners, which is going to be happening up at the Standard Dairy along MLK, that are right kinds of things to do. That's going to create a mix. The problem is, if you upscale sometimes, if you have a generation of poverty, that occurs not as a result of our past problems that we have in our society, you might chase that community out somewhere else. We have to be careful of that. So you need to build and assure that there are programs to keep people who live in those communities into those type of projects, because they're the ones that are going to work. But it is of a concern to me, and the thing that's different, I think, here, again in the Portland metropolitan area from other areas, is that we have a very vital center city. And we need to make sure that we have that same kind of vitality and mix of housing prices in Beaverton and Lake Oswego and Hillsborough and Gresham, and that we don't become exclusive in that. So I think Mr. Rusk's point was correct, and so we need to be aware of that and make sure we're not falling into that trap. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thane Jensen, member of the club. Mike, I'm a little interested more in impacts and consequences of expansion of the urban growth boundary specifically, and I'm wondering if you can quantify this for me, and forgive me if it's a stupid question, but I have to question whether or not 450,000 people inevitably will come into the Tri-County area in the next 20 years if we leave intact the urban growth boundary, or whether we expand it by 4,000 or 5,000 acres. It must make a difference as to how many people we're going to get in the urban growth boundary. And secondly, and I think a necessary extension of that is, to what extent will expansion of the urban growth boundary affect the ability to provide public services? It's going to have an impact on tax dollars and cost to the taxpaying public as to whether or not we expand the urban growth boundary or not. I wonder if you could put some flesh on the bones of those questions for me.
I think you're right about the fact, and one of the things that we account for in our population forecast projections is that we're basing it on the fact that that there are some people who would choose not to come here, and so there is a leveling off of population as a result of the fact that simply because of its size, there may be folks who will go outward. And so the 450, by the way, is inside the metropolitan urban growth boundary. It doesn't include Clark County or some of the surrounding cities, which you assume will absorb some of the population. So some more of that can move out if we don't do it right. If we become less attractive, less manageable, lose our sense of place, and that population, if it comes into the region, by the way, a third of that is us. So when people talk about no growth, please remember, you can say that if you don't have any children, but if you do, you're part of the problem. So we have got to deal with those factors regardless. The second thing is, if the boundary needs to move, and I think there are reasons that it perhaps should, and logical ones in certain places, is I think there's an assumption on the part of people that we would be doing half-acre, one-acre lots out there somewhere. That's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is selecting places where we can create more Fairview villages, where we have the kind of place that's actually an urban village. And then the cost of providing infrastructure is less if you're in a more dense and compacted area. The failure to do that means that you move outside, you stretch your streets out, you get further out, your cost of infrastructure, sewers, schools, additional things is even greater. So we are in the process right now of looking what the cost would be in those areas where we would expand the boundary if necessary. And part of the test of that will be to have a master plan in place that includes how are you going to pay for that. There's questions, for example, if in the Damascus area is one of the places it's always looked at. Well, if that's a logical place to go for urban expansion, and I don't know if it is or not, if it's a low-cost area, what's the governance structure out there? The county, all the counties are getting out of urban services. You're going to urbanize it. Which city provides those services? Which ratepayers become subject of that? You see, or do you create a new city? So those kinds of questions have to be answered, and creating more governmental units is a cost and expense to the public that may not be desirable also. So there's a whole series of things that you would really better off, I would argue, of filling in as long as you do it right, and people can see that in their design standards.
We have time for one more question.
But it's
They're both tough guys.
Robert.
Robert Liberty, a City Club member. Mr. Burton, I was frankly surprised at your comment in response to another question that if the boundary is expanded by 60,000 acres, housing affordability wouldn't be an issue. In the last 4 years, the price of housing, for example, in the Wasatch Front, that's Salt Lake to Ogden and Provo, went up faster, went up 50% They have no urban growth boundary. The price of housing in San Jose and San Diego and Seattle is much higher than here. They have no urban growth boundary.
Robert, I think if you listen to the second half of it, if I wasn't clear, I said affordability wouldn't be an issue because the price of housing, current stock inside the city would plunge and you'd have a fall off of that market because everybody move off. Then what you've got is the Myron Orfield effect because you die the center. Right. I'm not advocating that. The fact is that affordability, what happened is the houses like mine in North Portland would probably plunge to a price of about $75,000, which today is affordable. That's not the right thing to do.
I'll be interested in
Take a look at our housing needs analysis, Robert.
Okay.
Thank you very much. That's been a marvelous presentation. I think the size of the crowd today and the interest. Did I lose you as a friend? I'm sorry. Come up and talk to Mike right afterwards. Thanks all of you for being here. It's been a splendid program, and I particularly again want to say to Kellen Bullard and her committee, you did a marvelous job. Let's keep up the good work on these long-term studies. We're adjourned.
That was the beginning of the end in terms of this audience, and what, like it or not, and it was sometimes trendy, but it was nevertheless true, having known Philip since school days and having been to his concerts since the very beginning, very early on he was getting a very different audience from the music scene. He was getting artists and all sorts of other people. And then finally, he and Steve Reich brought back the composer as performer, and I don't just mean occasionally accompanying some songs, but I mean getting a group and getting out there. They had to do it because nobody else would play their music, right? So they got out there with their own ensembles, and they were hitting the road and being part of a part of the ensemble, which is exactly what most of the great composers have done. I mean, it did in the old days, Mozart and Bach, and they were playing regularly, Haydn as well as writing. So I just leave you with two paradoxes to ponder. One is that greater freedom doesn't necessarily lead to greater art. And the other is that great art must be preserved, but a lot of the most vibrantly creative periods have not been particularly interested in the art of the past. We've got all these golden oldies radio stations on now in commercial radio playing hits from the 60s and everything. In the 60s, you didn't have many golden oldie stations. Everybody was playing modern music. Nobody was particularly interested in the old music. That is a paradox that I absolutely can't deal with. I'll be very unhappy if I someday can't hear a live symphony orchestra playing Mozart. And yet it also seems to me when you look around that when people really get into what they're doing and there's an audience there to support it and it's really going, they're not so interested in the past. So I'm going to have to skip some of what I think, the things I was saying about becoming part of a community, but I would like to just say that I think the more a part of a community, the better. Wouldn't it be great if the Oregon Symphony were sometimes used for church services, for instance? And here's where I have this great freedom. I don't have to worry about how you'd do that, how you'd pay for it. You know, you can't charge people to go to church or anything, but the idea of town musicians, I think, is a very attractive one. And if some of it is not so much fun, by fun I'm talking about art here, some other parts of it can be great art, and I think pieces should be commissioned much more for occasional things, for openings of buildings and stuff like that. There should be pieces commissioned and fanfares commissioned, and I think you almost get out of the worry of stylistic considerations, because if you use pieces in that very specific way, they either work or they don't. In the theatrical sense. If you've ever worked in the theater, you put up something in front of an audience, it works or it doesn't. Now, one audience may be bad, but I mean in a run, you get an idea of what works and what doesn't. So you're not talking about 12-tone, non-12-tone, you're talking about does this piece work? And then the composers that do pieces that work for that, you use more. And then using the abilities of the people in the organization. A lot of musicians are very articulate and very outgoing and are good at bringing people in, as many of you know. I know you've used them in kids' concerts and everything. And as you know, many musicians have tremendous senses of humor, and that's something very much worth using too. A lot of the most serious jazz people, when they play in clubs, they do a little banter between the numbers. It's comedy. I mean, they don't feel that that takes away from the art. Here again, like everything else I'm saying, you can't make a rule. Dizzy Gillespie had a lot of humor in his show. Miles Davis was completely serious. But it can be done with the humor, and I'd like to end up with a couple of my favorite musical jokes. I'm going to set it up with, some of you may know the P.D.Q. Bach cantata Knock Knock, which I used these jokes in, all but the last one. Just a bunch of my favorite jokes of this form. Here is the answer. What is the question? The answer is Dr. Livingston, I presume. And the question is, and what is your full name, Dr. Presume? The answer is chicken teriyaki. The question is, what is the name of the only living kamikaze pilot? And then two of the best ones I know are musical. There's a highway that goes up the west side of the Hudson River called 9W. So the answer is 9W. The question is, do you spell your name with a V, Mr. Wagner? And then the one I couldn't use in that cantata, it just wasn't practical, is, the answer is, shoe fly pie, apple pan dowdy makes your eyes light up and your stomach say howdy. Shoe fly pie, apple pan dowdy, can't get enough of that wonderful stuff. And the question is, et pour monsieur?
Well, I have the privilege of asking the first question and running the risk of maybe being serious. I was wondering if you could share with us what the symphony has meant to you in your life.
Okay. In my life. Well, one of the things I sort of had to cheat a little bit on because I got going too long, telling too many anecdotes, is the business about involvement. To me, one of the biggest tragedies of the budget cuts that are going on, not just to orchestras but to schools, is that there's nothing that takes the place of doing it. I mean, you can explain something to people. It's better yet to show them, but best yet is to have them do it. And my brother started playing violin when he was about 9, and when he was a young teenager, he was very discouraged. He was about ready to give up. And his teacher, who was the concertmaster of the Fargo-Moorhead Community Orchestra, got him into that orchestra, and he switched to viola, and he is still to this day a fanatic chamber music player, and he will use any excuse to get people to play quartets. I played bassoon in that orchestra. Like many bassoonists, I started out on clarinet and went to a very fine clarinetist in the Fargo-Moorhead area. And he said, Peter, you've got so many bad habits on the clarinet, it would be easier for you to start a new instrument. And so he suggested the bassoon, and I realized later he had ulterior motives, because the Fargo-Moorhead Orchestra was and is, I mean, it still is, but then it was much more amateur, a very enterprising orchestra. I mean, this is an amateur orchestra, a mostly amateur orchestra, that had high school kids in it and everything. And in about 1950, we played a piece by Messiaen. We played the first Shostakovich Symphony, and there was a lot of interest in music in Fargo. And we had William Masellos out on some concert series to play the Ives Concord Sonata, and So I did take up the bassoon very happily and played it for about 10 years in high school and at Swarthmore College until I got to Juilliard, where there were real bassoonists around who knew how to make reeds, and gave it up. And the only bad time I had as a bassoonist was once the Sigvald Thompson, the conductor of the orchestra, after a rehearsal, took me and Meyer Osterfield, the other bassoonist, we were high school buddies, both of us cared passionately about music, and he said, "Could you two fellas not weave around so much when you play?" Because both of them, and with the bassoon, you really see that. So he said it was a little distracting. So, and then the other thing I'll say about that question was that here I was playing bassoon, and my brother was already a fanatic chamber music player, and getting both kids our age and our parents' generation over to play quartets. There were often quartet evenings, or high school quartet afternoons with high school kids. And I was just sitting there watching scores. And one summer, all the cellists we knew went to Interlaken, and so I got to play the cello parts on bassoon. And I don't know that Mozart and Haydn and Beethoven would have been pleased, but it absolutely just, I was interested already, but I became fanatic then, and actually playing in it just brought me inside that music in a way that just sort of following the scores or listening hadn't done. So I think the symphony has meant a great deal to me, and it's meant a lot to me in terms of, as a composer, that I have played in a symphony and sort of know what it's like on that part of on that side of the podium. I have to tell another great conductor story, which, musicians often at a place where it's particularly tricky, where the tempo changes or something, they'll draw eyeglasses, which means watch the conductor, because it's tricky here. I once had a part which had been used, obviously, by another orchestra in which the conductor was not very good, because it had eyeglasses in a circle with a bar through it, So, who's the next one?
Peter, thank you for your wonderful talk today. And I just have a short question that I think relates to much of what you said. But do you think there's ever a useful distinction between high and low art, and in particular between high and low music, or art music and entertainment music? Is that distinction ever useful?
I guess my feeling about that would be that I don't know that, as far as I'm concerned, it's ever useful in terms of what I think of the music. The only time it might be useful is in where you present it and how you present it. I do think that there's, a sort of a really good Cajun band that really gets down is not necessarily going to be as good in Carnegie Hall as they are in the club where they usually play. And so I think that, that's one of the reasons that I think it's good for symphony orchestras, is to at least explore the idea of playing in different surroundings, is to get to different people and see what works and what doesn't work. I personally am not much of a fan of music outside, for instance, except for real potato salad music. I mean, in terms of, really listening to a symphony outside, I would rather just listen to the birds and listen to the symphony inside. But I think that the New York Philharmonic playing in Central Park, a lot of people really enjoy it when it doesn't rain, and it can mean a lot. But I think that I know just in my own musical tastes, Ray Charles is as great as anyone, as far as I'm concerned. And when you're talking about that kind of music, you're talking about somewhere in between performing and composing. I mean, he's sort of composing as he's performing. But I think that the distinction might be made in terms of where to present it. And as I said, the one thing I really don't know how to answer is how it should be supported. If there's a way of supporting music that seems to work best in very informal situations, if there's a way of supporting it without making it too establishment so that it loses the informality. Yeah.
Len Fraser, member of the City Club of Portland. You said there should be no shoulds, and my fellow members are going to recognize I'm breaking a should. You remarked that children should have the opportunity to perform. I would like you to carry as you leave Portland that the Metro Council yesterday voted to approve a future vision statement which included that a high priority of this region is to have all children have access to participate in the visual, literary, and performing arts in community centers.
Oh, great.
Intelligence. 2 is expertise in terms of your knowledge of what you're talking about. 3, I've forgotten. But 4 is the wonderful sprinkle of humor that you bring into your remarks.
After my own heart.